that's a little bit misleading. We may want to say improvability of the human condition through self-effort as a communal act. There's a possibility to improve the human condition, of course, including human nature, but not simply as an individual effort, but as a communal act. So human nature is not fixed. It is always in the dynamic process of transformation. But there's also the awareness that human desires are very strong. They're problematical. Mencius is critically aware of that situation. But Mencius appears to the sensitivity of the heart as an internal mechanism for self-improvement, self-transformation. Xunzi is not as optimistic. Xunzi argues that we need a rational calculation, a pragmatic consideration. In order to avoid danger, Xunzi, you can say, established the minimum requirement for human survival, not just human flourishing. You have to have a social, a safety net for survival. You establish the basic. You have to understand your self-interest as a community. So he argues for a kind of reasonableness, the reasonable way of dealing with the situation, because we are worried about the unintended negative consequences of the desires, the passions in human nature. We need to acquire intentional acts. It's not social engineering. It's not simply imposition of ideas from above. But we need to involve ourselves, all of us, in an intentional act, try to change the situation. We need good design, good organization, good structure, and long-term planning if we want to make our society function well. Social solidarity can only be achieved through the active action of human rational calculation, the function of the human mind. We need to harmonize our passions. There are a lot of disruptive passions. If they are not checked, they become extremely bad for social solidarity. They are antisocial, such as anger, jealousy, aggression, possessiveness, obsession. So we need to develop a deterrent. And this is when we say we, including all of us who are likely to express our feelings in an excessive form. So we need to develop the lowest common denominator, the minimum requirement. Law is important. I don't want to underscore that point. Law is absolutely critical. Punishment. But it is ritual, which is invitational, which encourages us to move beyond the minimum requirement of being just an obedient and responsible member of the society. But ritual is invitational. It transforms us from simply ordinary human beings trying to survive to be able to build civilizations, institutions, to make ourselves beautiful, brilliant, and transformative. But Xunzi is always critical, always aware of the precariousness of the human condition. The precariousness of the human condition requires conscientious building, and building is painfully difficult. Destruction is instant, but building is painfully difficult. The cumulative process is extremely slow and cumulative. So we need to mobilize all our efforts in order to deal with the situation. We need to, all sensory perceptions need to be cultivated. The proper way of seeing, the proper way of hearing, the proper way of smelling, the proper way of tasting, the proper way of resting our four limbs. All of them need to be cultivated. This is not given. And all institutions available to us, family, school, society, government, all kinds of civic organizations above the family, below the state, will all have to be mobilized in order to deal with the situation. And as an individual, as a person who is involved in study, we must exercise a kind of deliberate action. We should have the deliberate action of the mind to engage in this process of study. This is not only required of us, it's required of every human being, including the sages. The sages are the people who are keenly aware, acutely aware of the precariousness of the human condition. So the encouragement for study, I think one very illustrative way of understanding Xunzi, what Xunzi has in mind, is actually in the Doctrine of the Ming. It says, study it extensively, inquire into it accurately, think over it carefully, sift it clearly, and practice it earnestly. When there's anything not yet studied or studied but not yet understood, do not give up. When there's any question not yet asked or asked but its answer not yet known, do not give up. When there's anything not yet thought over or thought over but not yet apprehended, do not give up. When there's anything not yet sifted or sifted but not yet clear, do not give up. When there's anything not yet practiced or practiced but not yet earnestly, do not give up. If another person succeeds by one effort, we will use 100 efforts. If another person succeeds by 10 efforts, we will use 1,000 efforts. If one really follows this course, though stupid, we will surely become intelligent, and though weak, we surely become strong. This is Xunzi's message for study, for inquiry, for sifting the differences, for putting everything into practice. But Xunzi also is very strategic. He says very clearly that you don't, if you want to run, if you don't have the energy, you want to get to your destination, just by forcing yourself to do it, you will not be able to make it. You have to have a strategy of understanding how you position yourself. For example, a little tree may be only 4 inches tall on the tall mountain, overlooking the whole panoramic view. So you should get to the top of the mountain. No matter how tall you are, if you cannot get to the top of the mountain, you will not be visible. If someone shouts following the wind, the voice will be carried. If you shout against the wind, nobody will nobody will be able to hear you. This is called in typology, in geography, the advantageous position. The advantageous position may be government authority, sagely accomplishments, teachers, all kinds of social forces can provide the advantageous position for you in terms of your learning. You cannot afford to be totally isolated in that pursuit. Learning is always cumulative. It's a habit formation, very much in the tradition of Aristotle, or also in the tradition of Kant. Kant has made the observation that human temperament is so weak, so easy to be destroyed. So we need to build ourselves up. We need to discipline ourselves. We need to learn the rules of the game. Rote learning is useful. Memorization is useful. Repetition is useful. Like the bird learns how to fly, the Chinese word xi, which means practice, meaning the 2 wings. Always learn. All the animals, they learn repeatedly in order to perfect their art. And this process of, for example, reading the classics, recitation, memorization, all these mechanisms are related to the internalization of the skills. Once the skills become internalized, they become an integral part of you. You become transformed by these skills. When you first learn how to drive, you're very self-conscious. Once you really know how to do it, then you'll flow very, very well, provided other people also follow the same pattern. But that sense of spontaneity can never be achieved if the internalization is not complete. It's important to know that from the Xunzian point of view, ritual as an internalized act is not simply formalistic. the attentiveness of the mind will always be there. For example, a dancer who is able to dance perfectly according to the score or the design of choreography. We just look at it. We say, fine, that's perfect. Not necessarily. A teacher may discern, just go through the motion. There's no spirit in it. You know, in the Olympic Games, normally there are 2 scores for either divers or so forth. One is skill, technique, which can be quite objective. The other one is style. The style requires some subjective discernment on the part of the judges and how you do it. So not just the internalization of the rules of the game, but also the attentiveness of the heart is always there. It is in this sense, not only you want to learn, sometimes you want to unlearn. Unlearn the bad habits in order to accumulate the good habits. I have one example, I think it's very interesting. You know a great pianist, Arthur Rubinstein. He gave his first performance as a virtuoso at age of 11. So he's an accomplished pianist. In his 30s, he met a teacher. The teacher said, you did it all wrong. Your fingering, not right. It's not proper. You'll not be able to grow. Now, there are 2 decisions. He already world famous. He would not be able to go back to find a teacher and to start with do, re, mi, fa, sol. He's already given concerts all over the world. Or face the fact that I have to unlearn. Now Rubinstein, to his credit, faced the fact. Yes, I'm wrong. I never really played it correctly. He started from the very beginning. 6 hours, 8 hours, 10 hours, just to go through the regimen and learning how to use his finger correctly. By 40, after about 12 years of struggling, by 40, he knew he got it. So from 40 to 80, I heard a concert he gave when he's in the 80s. Just every concert, it's, if not perfect, it's just an inspirational act. So how to unlearn when you realize there's some defect in your overall composition? It requires courage. We have another example, a great violinist by the name of Yehudi Menuhin. Many of you may have heard about him. He also was a great virtuoso, played the Beethoven's violin concerto at age 11 at Carnegie Hall, and a world-famous musician. And then in his 20s and 30s, someone pointed out the way he held the boat was not right. He couldn't play the lower boat very efficiently. Now he made a different decision. He tried to hide it. He tried to use the upper bow all the time and try to avoid it. Soon enough, the connoisseurs realized, wow, my gosh, Rubinstein couldn't use, Yehudi Menuhin couldn't use the lower bow. Then, of course, even students became aware. But he still tried to hide it. And of course, this is in autobiography. It's an agonizing experience. But there's an interesting outcome to Yehudi Menuhin. Then he changed his style. He played with Indian musicians. He played with international music. He tried to become a composer. He tried to become a conductor. He became a very, very important musician, but certainly not the most accomplished violinist. Now, these 2 stories tells us you need to be aware, even though you become very, very accomplished, where you are and how to move ahead. This is reason that Xunzi, I think, a very, very good lesson for us. Xunzi puts his great emphasis on the discerning and discriminating capacity of the mind. He realized the human mind has the ability to differentiate, to know right and wrong, to know good and evil, to know beautiful or ugly, to know what is comfort, what is not, to know superficial things, deep things. The mind, in Xunzi's sense, maybe better translated as mind rather than heart, is not just the warmth of the heart, but it's the epistemologically important, other ways, the way to learn to understand something. And of course, sometimes it's disorienting to recognize that Xunzi concerning differentiation is linked to hierarchy. But hierarchy can also be understood as natural hierarchy. Natural hierarchy in the sense of the natural order of things. Mencius also recognized no 2 things are the same. They're all different. You have to have this kind of discriminating mind. harmony is never achieved by reducing differences into sameness. So the great unity is harmonious, but the great unity is not sameness. So don't search for sameness, for artificial equality. Search for harmony or the harmonization of differences. And Xunzi realizes the human mind in this sense is quite unusual. For some of you working in computer artificial intelligence, I think you recognize this. And his project then is to use the cognitive function, the knowing capacity, the differentiating, discriminating capacity of the mind to transform our nature, especially the passions in our nature. There are three qualities of the mind that are really quite distinctive. And of course, it's very easy for us to recognize it just by experiencing how our own mind works. First is, no matter how much information is stored, there's always the capacity to have new information, to be able to, the circuit is never loaded. The mind can be empty. Not that you put everything in the trash, but the mind can empty. Mind can empty itself. Impossible for us to imagine a situation where our mind is full, in the sense that we cannot take anything. Either in terms of sensitivity, in terms of information, there's always that capacity. Or if the capacity is lost, there's something fundamentally wrong with your mind. And that cultivation, of course, is very easy. So the mind is empty, even though all kinds of information is stored in the mind. So the capacity to store. The other thing is the mind sees things in patterns. Now I use the term pattern recognition, not just the digital linear progression, pattern recognition. Information, data, ideas, impressions, images come into the mind in fragmented ways. We walk along the yard and we see all kinds of things. But there's the capacity of the mind to synthesize, to integrate, to have a general pattern. The pattern gradually emerges. I say sometimes you have to suffer through certain kind of fuzziness. We call it fruitful ambiguity. And gradually you will be able to see clearly. You let it build. But the mind has this capacity to integrate and to synthesize and to see coherent pictures, even in terms of very fragmented and distorted images. Then the mind is also tranquil, quiet, like the water. The mind can be tranquil, even though our experience is such that we're always in a kind of restless landscape. We move, then all kinds of forces exert influences upon us. But the capacity to maintain an equilibrium or equilibrium state in a dynamic process of changing and transforming. This is what the mind is able to do. So Xunzi, maybe under the influence of Taoism or other kind of spiritual cultivation of the time, realized the tranquility of the mind is like the mirror. If the water is tranquil, then the mirror will be able to reflect things as they are. And it's important to keep the calmness of the mind as a way of understanding external realities. Later, of course, in Buddhism, in Taoism, they develop very complicated techniques of the quietude of the mind. But Xunzi already in his epistemology that the mind, you should try to keep the mind calm, tranquil, the mind will be able to reflect. You keep the mind empty, so the mind will always be able to restore, and you keep the internal structure coherent, so the mind is able to integrate. So the basis of morality then for Xunzi is the rationality of the mind, which is the psychological capacity every human being is endowed with. And also the sense of our mind's understanding of social utility. It is important for us to control our passions, control our various kinds of desires and aggression, because unless we do that, we'll not be able to become a responsible, participating member of the society. Social solidarity is critical. So you can even see Xunzi, like mentions, there is the interplay between the external and the internal. Externally, we know we have to be a member of the social community. internally, we have the capacity of knowing, the rational capacity of the mind, and the combination of the two, through self-discipline, through cultivation, will make us moral. There's a dilemma. The dilemma is Xunzi's notion of using the cognitive function of the heart and mind to control nature. Now we know Mencius argued the reason that human nature is good is because each one of us is endowed with the capacity of doing good because of our four beginnings. So it's internal to us. Xunzi also thinks it's internal to us, but that interiority, from Xunzi's point of view, is not our nature. So human heart and mind is not our nature. Our nature is passion, very much like Kant, like many other Western philosophers. Our nature, what is endowed in us, are these passions and these desires that we have to overcome. So the question is simply, this mechanism of using the heart and mind to control nature, can we develop autonomous morality? Autonomous morality means that we can guarantee that if we want humanity, humanity will come. We can always guarantee that. That's autonomous. Xunzi and Mencius all believe in self-effort as a communal act. There's no disagreement. Self-effort, not effort by someone else, not defer to an authority outside. You have to do it yourself. That's why self-cultivation is important. But whether Xunzi can develop autonomous morality or not is a question that we need to we need to explore a little bit further. But in a subtle way, there's something very significant, and very few scholars have dwelled on this point. Very important in Xunzi. This is Xunzi's idea of sociality. You know, Fingeret puts a lot of emphasis on sociality, on society, on sociality. The social dimension is predicated on a very sophisticated understanding of the significance of the other in one's own existence, especially in terms of child rearing, how a baby is capable of surviving and flourishing in the human community. This is later some scholars call it dependency need. We don't have to elaborate on that. But one illustration is important. This is something that I'm sure that Mencius would agree. There's a rather dramatic example. I think the psychologist Erik Erikson once made the observation. In the concentration camps, virtually all children under the age of 6 died. Even though they were provided with food, with shelter, with clothes, they died. The reason they die, it's not just a psychological explanation, is that children, young children, need to be communicated. They need to see an eye, the eye will see back. They need to be heard. They need a sound. They need to be touched, or need to be hugged. And they need to be able to sense they're in the presence of others. But in a concentration camp, you see these photos, big eyes looking outward. There's no response. And they just fade away. They die. Now we know that some people were in solitary confinement in a jail for 19 years, for 20 years, and survived. Some of them survived beautifully afterwards. But these are adults. These are the people who have memory. And they survive because the memory is linked to hope, and hope is linked to the childhood experience of being loved and cared, touched, and concerned. So in that sense, no human being is able to survive without the significance of the other. Now this provides, I think, a very, very good reason for Xunzi also. We talk about Xunzi as a tough-minded Confucian. Later, of course, some of his students become legalists. But if you look at his discussion of music, discussion of art, discussion of kingship, even discussion of military affairs, there's a great deal of emphasis on the importance of empathy, the ability to enter into the existential situation of another person, which is the other side. We need the dependency need. We need to be careful. At the same time, we can develop the capacity of understanding the other through empathetic appreciation, or to strike sympathetic resonance. We use our body as a measure how we feel if we were in his or her situation. And therefore, the training they call it sensitivity training, or the training of becoming aware, it's not programmed. We have to train ourselves to be open, sensitive to the music, to the art, to the culture that become an integral part of us. It is not psychological technology that can be simply manipulated, because that psychological technology that is manipulated, even as sensitive training and so forth, eventually will be self-defeating, because it's a gradual process of learning. But that gradual process is dynamic, and not only dynamic, the danger, I think Xunzi made it very clear, the danger is inertia and three dangers: inertia, limitation, and self-deception. Inertia is the habit that becomes confining, rather than the habit that provides spiritual resources for further development. Limitation, especially self-imposed limitation, is to say your communicative network is being frozen, and you need to move beyond. The most important, of course, we'll have a chance to talk about it, is to overcome self-deception. So the whole chapter on dispelling obsessions, it's epistemological. It is an art of knowing. It's to help us to transcend not only our own egoistic sense of the person, but also to judge the different kind of doctrines, ideologies, ideas that may turn out to be detrimental to human flourishing. So Xunzi becomes very, very attentive to knowledge, disputation. Now, one of the chapters not included in our reading is called The 12 Philosophers. In fact, it's the earliest Chinese historical and critical reflection on other schools. He talked about all the other schools, what's wrong with them. Of course, he criticized Mencius as well. That's a Confucian school, but also Taoism and some legalistic ideas. So he's very critical about his own position. And he's involved in disputation, in argument. As many of you know, the texts that we read are actually composed and authored by him. But this notion of using the cognitive function of the mind and the heart to transform our nature is also linked to his rather elaborate understanding of the necessity of building institutions. Elaborate institutions. I used that term a number of times, tradition and social capital. Used that a number of times. I'm still groping to find a better way of really understanding it. Actually, two political scientists helped me. One scholar in the government department's been working, using the idea of social capital, working in India. And he discovered that one city in India called Lucknow, I actually visited that city. Unlike other cities of the same economic background, same political situation, same kind of ethnic composition and religious composition, for the last 50 years, Lucknow never experienced a major communal fight, a communal struggle, communal conflict tension. Many other cities around the area all experience that. Why? His careful study over a number of years discovered that in Lucknow, there's an interesting mechanism, a forum, that leaders of different religious traditions, of the Muslims, of the Hindus, Sikhs, and others, always, not every week, but every 10 days, gather together for informal conversation, with no agenda, not to dispute, not to settle any dispute, just to meet. And that mechanism is a very long history, had a very long history. Because of that mechanism, all kinds of conflicts, potential conflicts, became anticipated. They could diffuse the conflict. Rumors would not be accumulated. Just one mechanism. Of course, how to put it into practice is a complicated one. So this is one example. The other example is used by Professor Putnam himself. His whole notion about social capital is now talking about the United States, but earlier he's studying Italy. There's a difference between northern Italy and southern Italy. Democracy functioned well in northern Italy, but not necessarily in southern Italy. And he realized, among all kinds of other organizations, there's one organization in northern Italy that is particularly interesting. That's male choruses. The males get together and form singing groups. Very popular. Now, singing, when you have a chorus, the CEO, a waiter, a worker, a farmer, or a military person or bureaucrat get together and sing regularly, practice. They communicate among themselves. Sometimes they get together with families and talk. That mechanism, originally not intended to promote democracy, turned out to be extremely useful for the accumulation of some kind of capital which is not economic, which is not quantified. Last time I used an example, I don't think it worked very well, with Emerson. Emerson's example about the ceremony, graduate ceremony at Harvard. Now, if you think about it again, a university, our university is called corporation, the earliest corporation in America. Many of the terms that we use, which I would call fiduciary communities, community based upon trust, such as all these terms are now used by financial institutions. Trust, fiduciary obligation, corporation. Corporation, it's not a multinational corporation. Corporation is a corporation of people getting together for the common good. But these things are important to cultivate. Xunzi, if you read Xunzi, please keep in mind the accumulation of these kind of resources. And this reminds me very much of a very interesting example. This is an example of Buddha. I think we can also use Buddha's example as our understanding of the social capital. Buddha will ask, Sakyamuni, often will ask when they visit a place. He asks the following questions. Do they value discussion and dialogue? Do they value cooperation and solidarity? Do they value laws and traditions? Do they respect their elders? Do they respect children and women? Do they respect religion and spirituality? Do they value people of culture and learning? Are they open to such influences from outside, from abroad? Ask these questions. If the questions are answered in the positive, there's a lot of social capital being accumulated over there. Cultural competence. In the modern sense, I would simply say the study of the humanities. Now, in our university, we have social sciences, natural sciences, and the humanities. Humanities involved disciplines such as language, literature, history, philosophy, religion, cultural anthropology, I guess. Humanities, one way of understanding these disciplines, so they are the most intimate and relevant to human self-understanding. That's why they're called humanities. Language helps us to understand the tools we use to express ourselves and also how we formulate our thought. Literature is to help us to understand the most refined artistic expression of our ideas, of our symbols through the language. History is collective memory. Philosophy is to help us to think how we think, to give us the method of trying to understand how we reason, how we debate. And religion concerns our ultimate concerns. All these disciplines are very much linked to personal experience. It's not possible for you to get into any of these disciplines and say, well, I'm a literature major, but I never acquire any real interest or taste for literature. Or I'm a history major, I don't like the past. Or I'm a philosophy major, I don't like to think or to reason. These are, all of these disciplines are also related to the notion to animate the old in order to attain the new. If the old is not animated, the new cannot be attained. There's always this transtemporal dimension. And so aesthetics, ethics, religion, as I pointed out earlier, these areas are all part of it. And Xunzi, if you read Xunzi again, all over the place, the importance of the accumulation of cultural capital and cultural competence. Xunzi is particularly strong in understanding language. And also two ways of understanding language. As we all know, there's no private language. It's not possible for you to say, well, I have a language, no one else will ever be able to understand it. That's my language. I only speak to myself concerning that. Well, at least you have to find one person that will be able to decipher whether that's a language or not. But language is not private, it's open. Right? But it's always conventional, always historical. So this area of classification, we call NEAT, classification, C pattern. Language, for example, if you learn a new language, you can say learning any discipline is learning a new language. Language of physics, language of astronomy, language of computer, and so forth. When you learn a language, you have to go through this, what I call complicated pattern recognition. So it's a general progression. It's always leaps. Sometimes you feel that your language capacity has declined, then it will bounce back again. It's a different kind of dynamics of learning the language because the rules of the game are so complicated, so different. And there's no way you can be totally specified, totally feel that you're in control of every dimension of it. In addition to language, Xunzi also believes that ethical intelligence is related to epistemology, related to knowledge. Now, it's not clear whether Mencius will follow that role, because Mencius said learning consists of none other than the quest for the lost heart and mind. Xunzi believes that erudition, knowledge, inquiring about nature, about everything, will also help you to become intelligent. Not only in the cognitive sense, but also in the ethical sense. And I would just simply note that for Xunzi, later of course becomes highly controversial. For Xunzi, one of the most important business of the government is moral education. And later some of the legalists even argue that the bureaucrats, we have to learn from the bureaucrats, 以吏为师, to regard the bureaucrats as teachers. That turned out to be very detrimental to authoritarianism, of course. But Xunzi really believes that we need teachers. Teachers of classics, teachers as authoritative figures, not authoritarian, but authoritative figures in the classics, in ritual, in music, in art, in all kinds of cultural forms, and in the art of government. So all these authoritative figures, we thought people with authority, will have to be teachers. Authority has two meanings. One is authority figure, sort of impressive presence and sometimes oppressive with coercive power. The other sense of authority is very positive. He is an authority on Shakespearean literature. She is an authority on physics, in the area of physics. So if she is a physicist, an authority, then we defer to her on some of the very difficult issues. If he is an authority on Shakespearean literature, we defer to him if we have some problem with Shakespearean literature. So that sense of authority is absolutely necessary for any society to flourish. If you don't have, one of the problems we face today is that all the authorities have been demythologized and we don't have any sense. They are important. Politicians, the professors, scientists, business leaders, police leaders, anyone. There's no authority that would be able to speak with a certain kind of a voice. Maybe some talk show hosts still have some kind of authoritative power, we're not sure. But that sense of authority, try to read Xunzi and try to understand the importance of that. And in Xunzi then, there's a very different conception of what is the highest achievement of being human, the sage. Unlike Mencius and many other people, including Confucius, the sage, for example, the sage like Yao, the great sage king, his style of governing, he folds his hands because his moral example are so great. He's doing nothing, and yet, like the virtue of the profound person is like the wind, and the people are like grass. He's over there, and the grass cannot choose but bend. The whole society has been transformed because of that great presence. Sun, who is a barbarian, who actually came from a very abusive family, and he managed to overcome tremendous arts, eventually realized himself as exemplar of filial piety. And through this exemplary teaching, he also became extremely influential in transforming the world. Xunzi's image is very different. He has this image of Yu. Yu is the founder of one of the great dynasties in China, sometimes rendered with 2 dots. Yu. Yu is close to, the myth of Yu is close to the biblical, the Christian biblical notion about Noah. Because a big flood, the major problem. This is the Chinese solution to the flood myth. And Yu's father was appointed by the sage king to take care of the situation. And he decided to build big dams to stop the flood. Dams collapsed, flood became even more rampant. He tried again and again, failed. And the whole human world suffered. And he was executed because of his inability to perform the duty. Then Yu, the son, was appointed to take care of the problem. So in order to take care of the problem, he first traveled extensively in China proper, observing the geography, the typography, and study how river flows, and did a lot of work. Then he learned to become, in modern terms, a hydraulic engineer. Right? He had organizational skills. He mobilized large group of people and tried to build not just dams, but also the dikes, the canals, and try to allow the water to flow according to certain kind of patterns. For 9 years, he worked. Total spirit of self-sacrifice and work ethic, the public spiritedness. For the 9 years, he traveled at least 4 times close to the vicinity of his family, but didn't visit his family. He still worked with his co-workers. And after 9 years, he managed. So the water subsided, the flood was overcome, new irrigational system developed, people managed to maintain their livelihood. So if you look at the image of Yu, knowledge of nature, pragmatic consideration of all the problems, engineering problems, a mobilizational technique to inspire a large group of people, workers, to work ethic, self-sacrifice, exemplary teaching. All these qualities, Xunzi believed, are necessary for the cultivation of the person. Culture, from Xunzi's point of view, comes into being precisely because this cumulative act, because the sages, like Yu, also has the same nature as us, desires, jealousy, anger, all these desires. And yet he was able to use the cognitive function of his mind to mobilize people and organize themselves for the development of culture. Now this culture, which is the cumulative effort of numerous sages, worthies, and responsible people, in fact, we can say culture matters because without culture, human civilization, human beings will not be able to survive. And you use culture in 2 senses in this. One is culture is different from economy, polity, society. The other one is, say, Chinese culture, American culture, the culture of the Department of History, to use a kind of general sense of the ethos. So Xunzi is concerned about both. The more refined expressions of the human mind and spirit, that's different from economics, politics, and so forth, but at the same time, the ethos of the whole society as well. Now Xunzi, on the surface, I will end with this. On the surface, was rather aggressive towards heaven, as if it didn't pay that much attention to the transcendent reference. Page 86 in his discussion of heaven. Is it better to exalt heaven and think of it, or to nourish its creatures and regulate them? Is it better to obey heaven and sing hymns to it, or to grasp the mandate of heaven and make use of it? Is it better to long for the seasons and wait for them, or to respond to the season and exploit them? Is it better to wait for things to increase of themselves, or to apply your talents and transform them? Is it better to think of things but regard them as outside you, or to control things and not let them slip your grasps? Is it better to long for the source from which things are born, or to possess the means to bring them to completion? So on the surface, you have a rather aggressive attitude towards heaven, understood as nature. Don't just allow nature to take its own course, almost like the more modern Western Enlightenment idea of aggressiveness towards nature. You try to understand nature, you try to subdue, you try to control, try to manipulate. But this is misleading if you only follow that line of thinking. Because in the Xunjian structure of knowledge, to follow the way is absolutely critical. To follow the way is not only to follow the human way, but follow the human way that is most enduring, most complete, and most efficacious for human flourishing. And that way always has a transcendent dimension. So instead of talking about nature as something over there that we have to control, to manipulate, certainly there's an element of that in the quotes. He's thinking about a much more comprehensive way of being human. So all the institutions eventually established will have its own internal dynamics. And these institutions, together with disciplines imposed sometimes by the authorities, and the willing participation of all the members, at least the majority of the members in the society, for cultivation, then the precariousness of the human condition can at least be overcome. If we overcome that precariousness, the minimum condition is stability and order, and from stability and order, flourishing culture can come into being. Next week, we'll be talking about two texts. One is the Great Learning, the other way is the Doctrine of the Mean. And I want to, I don't have it here, maybe I can recite it. I want you to take the first chapter of the Great Learning. I hope you will be able to read it, hopefully to yourself out loud at least once. It begins with a statement, only the ancients, when they want to bring peace in the world, first govern their states. In order to govern their states, they regulate their families. In order to regulate their families, they cultivate their persons. In order to cultivate their persons, they rectify their hearts and minds. In order to rectify their hearts and minds, they make their wills sincere. In order to make their wills sincere, they extend knowledge. Extension of knowledge lies in the investigation of things. So only things are investigated, knowledge will be extended. Only knowledge is extended, the will be sincere. Only the will is sincere, the mind could be rectified. If mind can be rectified, then a person can be cultivated. If persons can be cultivated, then families can be regulated. If families can be regulated, then the states can be governed. And if states are governed, there's universal peace. So from the Son of Heaven to the commoner, each should regard self-cultivation as the root. So we'll begin with this observation, and you have a more comprehensive view of what Confucian ethics is about.